It's been a hell of a ride once again, but much like last year, there's a lot of things to cover and not enough time to cover it in. So in these last 2 episodes, I'll be going over everything I could have commented on but fell between my previous mentions. So, it's time to go over the Animals of Farthing Wood Series 2 overview, and much like last year, the best place to start is the story, so let's get into it. This year, the story was set up, paced, and concluded much differently from the way it was in the first series. Now, on first hindsight, that seems obvious considering that this series took its plot from 3 different books, whereas the first series only did the 1. But even with that, the way this series plots itself out, and the way that the individual plot points, stories, and characters are introduced to the audience, and the way that they're presented was still a bit different. The major element here is that even before the elements with bold's part of the story splitting off from the main one, from the very beginning there's always an element of multi-perspective and the use of cross-cutting for the editing, always showing us multiple stories than just the main one, and while the original series had some elements of that, they mostly kept in focus towards the main area of where the audience's attention was, having a narrative that was meant to be the main centre of everything. Here, even though there is still a main narrative, there's still a lot more distraction going on, which in a way is either a good or a bad thing. On the negative side, it is rather irritating that we keep getting distracted from the meatier narrative, which is clearly the part of the story that is the most interesting and meant to be the centre of the whole series, and yet we keep cutting back to the more light-hearted things such as the comic relief between the supporting characters, or the rather insignificant parts that didn't really need to exist to begin with. But on the other hand, this does actually allow for a story which had trouble incorporating all of its characters than it had in the first place into ways they could still be used. And even though it diminishes some of the roles that some said characters had, it at the very least allows them to still be the characters that they were in the first place whilst pushing their characters forward. A prime example would be Weasel, who could have easily been ignored a lot more after they made it to White Deer Park, but she still had her own little sub-story with her on and off love affair with Measley and her double agent role with Scarface, and it still allows her to be the character that she was. The same goes for characters such as Rabbit or Hare, who, even though they had much smaller roles, are still the initial characters that we wanted to keep seeing. However, even with that said, with the addition of new characters, particularly ones that are given major focus in the central story, there is still an element of some characters changing slightly, or in some cases just being eliminated from the story completely. We'll go into this more when we get to the themes element, but it just comes out that the writers, or whoever was responsible for these decisions, just considers the characters disposable, which is really a disappointing thing to see, especially when you're eliminating characters who had such a previous importance, e.g. Mole. That being said though, the new characters that are introduced are legitimately interesting and compelling characters, and the way that they're introduced makes them seem rather natural in that for the most part they seem to be at odds with the other characters, which again gives it a natural feeling of nature and the element that there's somebody behind any tree in the wild who's out to get you, which is a good thing to still see retained in this series even though they're supposed to have reached a sacred place. Speaking of which, actually, in terms of commentary, or just in terms of the story, it's good that they actually made White Deer Park a place that was not a perfect haven, but rather just another place where there are still problems. This is actually a very adult way at looking at things, in that no matter how much you try to escape one problem, there's always another problem when you arrive at where you are now, which is a really good moral to have for both children and adults, and of course it allows the story to progress in a way that feels natural. In terms of the actual plots of the individual stories, Winter may be the best of all 3 of them, simply because it was the best paced and all the plot elements seemed to converge naturally, and they seem to have, for the most part, proper closure. Plus it's nice to see some new surroundings and the visual for the animals to be in. We'd not seen them in a winter environment before, so to actually see them in it is actually quite nice. Bold's story may be the second best, and it's nice to see a very unique and very relatable coming-of-age story told from a woodland creature's perspective, and also in how unrelentingly harsh it can be, but in a way that feels natural rather than just being exploitive and unnecessarily gruesome. Though it does sometimes lead to having characters introduced that are a bit irritating, but thankfully you don't see them for too long, or if you do then there's something about them that at least makes you compelled towards them. And finally, while it's no means a bad story, the feud part might be the worst of all three in the series, simply because it had a very repetitive formula of Fox and Scarface taking very simple jabs at each other, and then finally having the battle at the end, which escalated quite quickly in the last few episodes. And in how some of the characters drastically switched their personality in order to contribute to the way the story required to be progressed. But even then, that's not a terrible thing, and it's still a very interesting story, especially in the way that you see the characters in a new light, whether for the better or for the worse, because it's always good to see the characters explore themselves in more elements and prove that they're not just two or even one-dimensional. And the story does provide the most satisfying and awesome action and visuals in the series. However, the main problem that persists in this story is a problem that was a minor case in the previous one and had not been attended to, and so was allowed to be made a much bigger problem in this one, in that there's no real big sense of closure anymore to some of the elements of the story, or even if there are, they're mostly shrugged off and not quite given the grandiose nature that they deserve. I discussed this at great lengths with Mole's death and in the previous episode in particular, but at the same time, elements of Mole's death and Scarface's death weren't really given enough focus or happened too quickly, and they weren't really given enough time to let it soak in. However, this is an oversight in which I'm willing to accept on the grounds that it is a TV show when they have a limited running time, particularly with the amount of story that they need to throw in. And while some of the scenes that they could have cut out would have been able to make this a bit more efficient, it does at the same time mean that there will be some characters who would not be given enough attention, so it's a tricky trade-off really. With that though, this was a very entertaining series, and it did once again do a very good job in adapting the novels, particularly when they had elements of the novels introduced with the plot of another one in order for things to feel a bit more integrated and a lot more smoothly set up, rather than just having distinct bookmarks in where one plot begins and another ends. And its ending, whilst leaving a little bit to be desired, does still leave you with somewhat of a warm feeling and does make you look forward to what's going to happen next. And now, time to get into characters. Now we're going to have to be a little bit different with this one this time because there are so many new characters in this series, and to be quite honest, I can't really cover every single one of them and every character from the last series, so we're going to have to make this a little bit easier. Now, who's died in this series? Okay. And who had no development whatsoever? Okay. Now, it is a shame that we can't actually go over these characters, but most of the characters who died and the characters that had no development whatsoever had really nothing that was about them that was different from the last series, so there's no point in going over them again. But they're still good characters anyway, it's just that I have no need to go over them when I already did it in the last year. So, let's get into supporting characters, and once again, smallest to largest.
I really do feel like a farthing animal now.
Mateless is definitely a curious character to be sure, in that what little we see of her in the earlier episodes, she comes across as a very kind but unassuming and almost mildly seductive element to the character she is when she presents herself to Mole. Yes, I seriously just said mildly seductive in relation to a female mole. Maybe I've been doing this for a bit too long. Regardless, there's not a whole lot that we see or even know about her when she's interacting with Mole. However, after Mole's death, she essentially just takes on the personality of her mate anyway. In fact, it's almost like she assimilated his personality once he died. And I know that some people might say that that's Mossy's character, but there's a little bit more to him, and we'll get to that later. Overall, a very simple character, though she's not just a gender swap version of the same character who she ends up with. That would be Paddock. Paddock really is nothing more than just a female version of Toad, really. But at the same time, there's no real bad thing about that because Toad was already a very enjoyable character as he was, and a female version is nice to see. And to be quite honest, I wasn't really expecting too much out of her since we only see her a few times and then she's never seen again in the next series. So it's a bit of a waste, yes, but not a whole lot to really say about her since she's really nothing more than just a female version of Toad. But again, there's nothing really too bad about that, to be honest. The rabbits didn't really change too much from the way they were in the first series, but again, that's nothing really too bad since they were already an enjoyable comedic double act, and they still keep on with their enjoyable banter whenever they get the opportunity. In fact, I feel the funniest moments are actually during when Mrs. Rabbit is pregnant and how Rabbit acts more like a pregnant woman than she does. Their kids, much like the old ones, didn't really get that much to do, though I think they at the very least got a few more lines than those ones did, and these ones are actually given funny things to say since they're clearly even braver and have more common sense than their parents, and their nonchalant attitude to their mother's potential death. Although speaking of which, the fact that these were more minor supporting roles, though they were given a bit more screen time than most of the other ones, does legitimately make Mrs. Rabbit's death at the jaws of Scarface all the more intense, and also a tad disturbing. But I do understand why they did it, since there wasn't particularly anything left you could do with the character. But it still was a tad over excessive, particularly since that there was no real need to have it happen, since Scarface was already at death's door at this point anyway. Rabbit continues to be his typical neurotic self after her death, and will also continue to do so in the following series as well, though admittedly in a much more downplayed role than he did in this one. Cat, or Filleray as I like to call him, is very much one of those characters that you don't often see, but every time you do you're glad that you have. He has a bit of Adder's snidey and slimy qualities to him, but also has an interesting element of class and dignity to him. He clearly doesn't care about anyone but himself, but he has got at the very least a very open mind and is warm-hearted enough to listen to people and eventually be convinced to help out for a good cause. Though he clearly bears grudges, as shown by how he attacked Kestrel and how he said that he was going to eat Toad, but in many cases his heart was still sometimes in the right place, though I do feel that he was wasted potential for the opportunity to make a great anti-hero kind of character, since his personality reminds me a lot of the Shere Khan from the Disney's Jungle Book film. But for what it is, it does work fine, and in many ways they really nailed down the personality of a domestic house cat with the way they presented him. Kestrel's character is definitely given a lot more scope than it was in the previous series, and is one of the few ways that the show's explored the idea of the oath not quite working when they reached White Deer Park, which of course led into some of the earlier plot points and plot developments of the Winter Story arc. And while her repetitive lines do make her a bit of an annoyance, the fact of how she feels and how she clearly regrets what she did does show how she is a truly good person inside, or rather animal in this case, and allows her to explore more emotions in her action and also go through a lot more and be a bit more of a central part of the story, at the very least during the first third of the series. And it was nice to see some bits of character development, especially for one who was very, very close to being an empty character in the previous series. But it's a shame that she didn't really get to go anywhere after that, and she basically returned to the way that she was in the previous series after said event, which is made even worse by the fact that in the following series she officially disappears never to be seen again. Which is really unfortunate because I actually really enjoyed watching her character, as simple as she was. However, once again for better or for worse, the way that they changed up things in the next series meant that they had to drop a few characters that they felt were unnecessary, and given how Kestrel's character affects the story, plus the fact that in the novel The Siege of White Deer Park she actually does leave the park on her own volition, it only made sense to have her move on. So while it is a shame, it is at least a natural progression for what she went through in this series, and I'm glad that they managed to take a more simple character and make her into more than what she was before. Dreamer, like I said in the initial reviews, has very little lines, but through her actions, and of course her name, you do get a sense of her personality. She's very carefree and happy-go-lucky, to the point where she doesn't quite see the dangers in the world and only sees the wonder and magic in it, which makes all the more sense and makes it all the more gruesome when she's found dead at the hands of Scarface. And there's also an interesting parallel to real life, in that innocence is always welcomed and is always a nice thing, but too much innocence applied to the real world can often get you into trouble. And it is kinda nice that they help soften the blow of her death by having her not too developed, thus making her not too connected to the audience. Though you could also argue that that's even worse, since it just makes her a piece of meat to be killed off for the purposes of shock value. But regardless, it was nice of the writers to give her somewhat of a character, and that we do actually seem to connect with her with her very simple but childish personality, though her death does seem a tad too exploitive to be true. I'll keep my criticism on Rollo brief because I went over him a great deal in his initial episode, but my point still stands that the idea of his character has merit, but some elements of the writing, and in particular the voice delivery, makes him insufferable to watch. Which is all the more unfortunate because when I see Rollo, I want to like him in many ways because he reminds me of myself a bit, a person who is very kind-hearted and childlike in his actions, but is often very clumsy and doesn't quite understand how other people perceive him. And when he does get lonely, he gets very downhearted and feels like he's quite useless. So there's definitely elements of a good character in here, it's just that the execution was so badly done that it makes it aggravating to be around. which is a real shame both in terms of what could have been and what will be. The Stag basically operates as the invisible boss man figure. You know he's there and you know what he's capable of, but he mostly stays out of the action and just allows his wisdom to be transpired amongst the people he's around, which in many ways is how you would expect him to be given how much he was built up on the previous series and how he's considered to be the great king of this amazing park. However, it does seem to hit a bit of a curve when he actually does do things and does actual actions in order to keep peace around the park, which are some of the best moments of Winter and some of the early parts of the feud storyline. But when things start developing more and more and he shows up less and less, it just makes you think why he doesn't step into the ring like the teacher during a schoolyard fight and tell them to break it up. Granted, it would be a definite anticlimax, but it would still make more logical sense. But even then, he's very kind and has that feel of Morgan Freeman from Shawshank Redemption about him, both in how he's a very wise and timeless character who's very close to our main character, and the fact that he continually narrates throughout the entire series. Though the presence of his narrations could be argued that it wasn't really necessary, since sometimes it feels like he's just pointing out the obvious and makes you realise how effective it would be without having the narration, with the exception of the catch-up parts at the beginning of the episodes. But even with that, he is still a very enjoyable character, and his presence does actually give a sense of authority around the park, which I think the writers might have picked up on considering what they did to his character in the next series.
I'm supposed to be a great hero. Well, I think it's time I lived up to the reputation.
Oh wow, we've got to discuss Fox now. Well, let the can be opened and the worms fly, because this is Fox's character in Series 2. Fox, when he starts off in this series, is basically the same as he was in the previous series. However, a major element that was changed in his character is that he had the element of leadership in his own mind removed from him. So this means that he felt that he had no more sense of a responsibility anymore, and that he could be his own free spirit and just be whatever he wanted to be. However, it clearly proved that in the previous series that he did too good of a job doing that, and so basically people kept coming back to him seeking guidance and protection, even though he had no interest in doing it again. But through basically a forced situation and the element of responsibility eventually coming back to him, he realised that it was his job to be the leader, and it was his job and his alone to guide and protect his friends. Fox during Winter is basically like John McClane from Die Hard. He wants to leave the life he left behind, but it just keeps coming back to him. In that regard, Fox's character throughout the rest of the Winter story arc is basically the same as he was during the later half of Series 1. Brave, stoic, headstrong, and willing to do anything for the protection of his friends and to do what was right. Which is kind of interesting in that regard, in that he's forced to use either motives or plans outside of his comfort zone in this one, which is always interesting when you get a character to do that, because it allows him to see more of himself, but also allows him to see different sides of him and how he feels about different elements within the position he's in this case leadership, and in Fox's case it came to him seeing how one person can make a difference, but how also many people can do so much more, and how he understood and how having his friends work with him and trying to eliminate the threats that came to them was the most effective thing that they could have done. And then the feud storyline came along and flushed it all away. Okay, that's being a bit harsh. In actuality, the way Fox's character changes is that he has realised how effective all the animals are at working as a team, but when the threat of Scarface came into his view, he realised that with that, how much you also have to lose, and there was no doubt that in the feud both parties had a lot to lose, and of course did. However, Scarface sort of commodified what he had to lose, seeing them more as things to be used or kept rather than people to care for. Fox, on the other hand, saw them as what they were, friends and family, and being that he had a lot more to lose than Scarface, and was a lot easier to lose because some of them were a lot more small and helpless, naturally he was pushed to the edge of his abilities and what he was capable of doing. In that regard, it clearly must have put him on the edge and put him under so much tension that it changed him, as we saw in how it changed his personality a bit in the later part of the series, exacerbated by the fact that he had more of his own flesh and blood to lose at the same time as the cubs were born, and show how easily it could have been to lose one after Dreamer's death. death. And while it is admittedly sometimes hard to watch Fox in how aggressive he can be, and some of the line deliveries don't help because it makes him sound like a judgmental jerk rather than the actual person who is trying to keep people safe, as shown by the way he chewed out Bold and Badger, you can still kind of understand where he's coming from, and he is still morally in the right zone. And the same could be argued for the moments where he finds out about Ranger and Chalmers' relationship. It's not really a show of bigoted prejudice, it's just from the fact that he knows that he comes from a family who is actively trying to go against his family, so why is this one individual any different from the rest of them? But thankfully we see that he is at very least calm and content enough to be able to hear him out and understand that he is actually a nice guy, and eventually openly admits that and allows Ranger to become Chalmers' mate. And in extension to that, we also see that despite how proud and stern he can be, he understands that he can make mistakes and admit that he does, which is one thing that separates him from Scarface, since Scarface would never even want to admit that he had made a mistake or what he did was wrong, but Fox is humble enough to know that he can and has, as proven by how he thought that the way that Bold wanted to deal with things may have actually been the right choice after all. And so, after all his aggression, chewing out his friends, and acting out of character, he eventually realises that the way he's been acting has resulted in the events that have transpired and have not made anything better, and it ends up coming to a big head with the fight between him and Scarface. And after the fight, he essentially, in a spiritual way, retires from his sense of leadership, since he now knows that there are people who are much younger and wiser than him, but can take his position instead, in how Chalmers was able to see the good in Ranger, and how Bold was brave enough to take charge of his own life at such a young age, which is actually reflected in the way he acts in the following series. But in that regard, it might just be me looking into it a bit too deep, as I always do. But even with that, Fox does go through a lot in this series, and allows us to see him in different ways, which may make us disagree with him, but that just means it makes him more of a three-dimensional character, in that he goes through different moods and swings and makes him into a person that we can either agree and like, or disagree and not like, just showing how much of a great character Fox really is.
We learn to tolerate one another, even look after one another.
As much as Fox develops in Series 2, it can be argued that Badger develops almost just as much, if not more, in a shorter amount of time. Once again, he starts off this series much like he was at the end of the last one, somewhat bumbling and absent-minded, but still kind-hearted and cuddly. But given how, through his age and his personality, that when things get hard and he's pushed around, figuratively speaking of course, more so than any of the other larger animals, or even he's normally accustomed to, that his moods naturally begin to switch, realising how harsh the world truly is, and also how no matter how much things get better, they can always get worse. And the mood that he takes makes him quite upset, but in a lot more violent way than you would expect. And this all bubbles to the surface when just so much bad stuff happens that he's eventually physically unable to go on and is being taken away to recuperate. But when doing so, he's introduced and shown a world that can be so much easier and so much kinder than the one that he's been in, and being how kind he is, he wants to naturally introduce his friends to it, but when they refuse and think that it's not a good idea, he gets angry because, again, he was introduced to a world where his friends were absent, but he was treated kindly and given respect, for the most part. But when he returns to his natural life, he isn't, and he realises just how hard it all was before, and so retreats back to the place where he felt that he was happy. But he's rejected again by that one too, so he's left in an interesting impasse where it felt like one life had rejected him, and one life most definitely rejected him, but then he realises that his original life was the right path all along, and returns to it triumphantly and realises where his home truly is. Yeah, I'm getting into very deep analysis in this portion, but if I get the opportunity, I take it. After that, he basically stays the way he used to be, kind and a little bumbling, but always nice to see, and he always provides the nice down-to-earth element during some of the more intense moments, though he clearly becomes more senile during the later parts of the series, which is also exacerbated by the fact on how he clearly regrets in how he treated Mole and some of the other characters the way he was during Winter, which comes out to be rather sad and revealing elements on how he refuses to acknowledge Mole's death. Whether he's aware of it or not, he clearly doesn't want to know, and so it shows how a kind old man who knows that he's nearing the end of his life doesn't want to be given such grievous news. But at the same time, he's still a nice character, and while it is a bit daunting on how Mossy acts like Mole, it does provide a little comic relief, and it's amazing given how much he's gone through and so much at the fact that even after all of that we still love this character, makes his death all the more powerful and legitimately sad to see this character, who we've gone along so much and has been so good to watch and be around, just leave. But at the same time, it brings in the element of the mortality of existence and how no one is truly immortal, no matter who they are. Although that does make me wonder how Toad's still kicking throughout the majority of Series 3. In short, he's always the same lovable character from the last series. He just goes through a lot more and does change a little bit, but ultimately is who he is, and we shall remember and cherish him always. Now that I'm done with that, I can finally get back to the more simple analysis of these characters.
It seems I'm the only one who still keeps the oath.
Owl's development is not truly in-depth this series. Basically the way it goes is that she again starts off the same as she was in the last series, and the progress throughout the majority of the first third of this series is the same. But then when the events of A Joke Backfire happened, she also realised how, one, the true raw sense of how people see her, and how her pride can get in the way of important matters. And while this isn't going into major character development like it did with Fox or Badger, it does allow her character to change slightly, being slightly less misanthropic, and how she is a lot more sociable with the other animals, and essentially becomes the baby fox's babysitter. By the end of the series, her pride is clearly taken a bit of a jab, but for the better, in how she becomes a tad more compassionate, shown by how she actively acknowledges that she was sorry for some of the decisions that she's made, something that she would have never have done in the previous series, and this goes a long way into developing her character in the next series.
There she is, the most beautiful creature you ever saw.
There's not too much to talk about with Toad this time, since he's essentially the same lovable buffoon that he was in the first series. Really, the biggest thing to happen to him in this series was his homing instinct problem, in that it was mostly just done for comic relief, and while the meeting of Paddock is in a sense character development, he really isn't changed too much other than revealing the way mating rituals work in his culture. Then again, this is nature, and it's very common to see that kind of thing, especially amongst amphibious and reptilian creatures. However, the seeds of the elements of his character that will eventually blossom into the way he's developed in the next series are set about.
Aren't you glad to see me?
We all knew this was coming, but thankfully I've taken my pills this time so I won't be going into a mad frenzy when discussing Mole's death, so let's get into it. Mole's character is more of a character who has to experience the way other characters are changed rather than experience change himself. He has to be the butt of Badger's anger when he starts to become more misanthropic during his moments in winter, and he's also one of the first people to be tormented by Scarface at the beginning of the series. But these events don't really change his character, with the exception of the events around Badger, which clearly makes him more hesitant to be around him. Even after they make up, he's still not seen as much with Badger when he's alive, which clearly had an effect on Badger in the way that he was desperate to see Mole again after he treated him. And then of course he meets his mate and the rest is history. Although just an observation, it does seem that Mole came out of his shell a bit more when he was with Mirthful, shown by how they played and danced around in the snow. Although it could be argued that that was where things went wrong, since that might have been what made him catch the illness that led to his ultimate demise, which I do still consider one of the most insulting deaths within the series, in how they just have him die off screen and they don't even give him a final moment to just be himself, which is surprising that after all the things I could have made an argument for in this being effective towards the story, or just being something that worked in some other way, that this death still pisses me off, and so we have to say goodbye to one of our most beloved characters in a way that feels more like it was just a passing. So I'll choose to remember the character from the way he was rather than the way he went out.
And here I am risking my neck for them. Stupid, silly Weasel.
Weasel actually gets a surprising amount of development in this series. Firstly, of course, it starts off with her meeting Measley and seeing how she avoided him because she initially had no interest in him, and then in her encounters with Scarface, which made her go back to Measley because she felt that he was the only one who truly cared for her and understood her. But that was made even worse by the fact that even Measley wanted to stay away from her at that point because he didn't want to get into trouble the same way she did, which must have made things tough for Weasel to have to basically avoid every person she came across, and by the fact that she breaks down and cries a few times, something that she only did a few times and it was for more insignificant moments in the last series. It shows how much her character had to go through and how hard those events were on her, But after she eventually proved her innocence in her relation to Scarface and how she was made just as much of a victim as Fox and his family were, her friends eventually come around and eventually she returns to the way she was, but a bit more inclined to help her friends and be a little more kind to everyone else around her, particularly Measley, and basically continues through the series being who she is, which you can always argue can either be a good or a bad thing. But despite what I say in this series, I always find that the occasional bit of comic relief from her is something that we do need. Though I could have really done with a lot less singing in this series.
I'm going to give him a taste of what adders are really made of.
Ada's more major character development doesn't really happen in this series, but there are some elements that show that her character does change a little bit, and in many ways you could argue that it was for the worst within the internal context of the show. She spends most of the first half of the series absent due to her hibernation, but when she comes back, she's basically constantly abused by most of the people she comes across, which causes her to become a lot more distant from everybody else, and also consider herself to be basically the lone assassin, if you will, wandering around White Deer Park, desperate to find the one person who wounded her more than anyone else ever has. So the events of this series, in a way, has made her a lot more hesitant to be sociable towards other people, which in a way both aids and also hinders her character development in the following series. But in terms of the character, she's still the lovable, slimy firebrand that we always love to see.
We just have to face it. You're not an ordinary fox and never will be.
Like I said in the last series, Vixen's character doesn't go through that much change throughout the entire 3 series, though there are at least events that have made her change her actions in this series. The major one being how her cubs obviously went through many things that she never imagined or wanted them to go through, making her a lot more protective of the things she has to protect, and in some ways becoming a little bit more like Fox, just a little less aggressive, which all then comes to a head when she's forced to show her power and superiority to Lady Blue, who is in many ways the complete opposite of her in a character, and her insults towards her and the way she lives her life, it naturally makes her feel worse about herself, and so the actual fight shows how she's gone from more than the pacifist she used to be into someone who is willingly wanting to be a little bit more active and is a lot more defensive over the things she can lose, which is definitely played up more in the next series.
Sounds like rather a good arrangement to me.
Whistler's character, as I mentioned throughout the series, has definitely changed a lot since the previous, whereas before he was a very kind, gracious, and almost a rather suave kind of character. Here, his delivery is still like that, but his character has changed to be a lot more selfish and almost self-absorbed in some ways. Now we can kind of see where that personality comes from in how he wished that he could be with another heron like himself, and then when he gets his wish, he didn't quite get what he was expecting, and so naturally he's gotten what he's wished for all his life, but he doesn't really know what to do now, particularly since what he got was not what he wanted. And Speedy's a lot more active and forceful personality naturally made him quite subjugated, which would probably make him quite irritated, which is definitely proven more when Al tells him to stand up for himself more, and clearly changed his character to be a bit more self-actualized, but it just takes away the kind of elements of his character that we liked watching about him, and also make him a little bit unwatchable in some moments. I also noticed that he might have been starting to harbour a crush on Kestrel, and I say that because in New Enemies he looks at Kestrel with a very longing expression and is annoyed when Speedy shows up, and he was surprisingly keen to have her stay with him and Speedy when she was injured. This might just be me overthinking it, but given how his relationship with Speedy has gone, it wouldn't surprise me. Though thankfully, whilst his character is reduced a little bit in the next series, he does return to a bit more what he used to be like.